Welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast, where today's brightest minds in the medical device industry go to get their most useful and actionable insider knowledge direct from some of the world's leading medical device experts and companies.
So whether you are a startup or an established company, one of the things that you do need to focus on is the value proposition of your device product development efforts. And I have a real expert on this episode of the Global Medical Device Podcast on this topic, and it's Scott Phillips. Scott is the CEO with StarFish Medical, and we dive into this topic, compare and contrast, the startup lens versus the established company lens, and I think you're really going to like this, so enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast. This is your host, founder, and VP of Quality and Regulatory at Greenlight Guru, John Spear. I'm really happy about today's guest. I've been a big fan of his and his company's work for quite some time. Joining me is Scott Phillips, CEO of StarFish Medical. Scott, welcome.
Thanks so much, John. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
So before we dive too deep into our conversation today, maybe give people a little bit of a perspective of your background in StarFish Medical, and more specifically, how StarFish Medical can be an asset or a resource to help them.
Sure. So StarFish Medical, we're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year, which means I'm not as young as I used to be. And we are a contract product development company, specializes in the med tech vertical. We like complex electromechanical devices of all different types, diagnostic instruments, some surgical devices, some biotech assay kind of things, variety. We have about 140 staff, headquartered in Victoria, Canada, with another regional office in Toronto. So we cover both east and west of the continent, and we work with clients primarily in North America.
All right, I appreciate that. And folks, go to starfishmedical.com to certainly learn more about some of the projects and the things that the team has done there, and a little bit more about Scott and others from StarFish Medical. Really a great company making a difference in the industry. And 20 years, it's no small feat. So congratulations on that, Scott.
Thank you. It's a little shocking.
Time flies, doesn't it?
Well, I was reminiscing that 20 years ago, next month, I went to make the first pitch for this new concept company. And because of that, and the doctor was so fascinating to talk to and so insistent that I spend time with him, that I was late to my mom's 60th birthday. So
oh no!
So this year we'll be celebrating her 80th birthday at the same time as.
Well, tell her happy birthday.
Thank you so much.
So you and I were catching up the other day, and we started diving into a topic, and I'm like, this would be perfect for the Global Medical Device Podcast. And I guess the title or the top level idea is medical device product development value proposition.
Yes.
But more specifically, talking about, there's kind of a yin and a yang that's happening, whether on this topic, the value prop, as to whether or not you're a startup or whether or not you're an established company. I mean, those things matter. Or what creates value matters very, very much so, depending on your state of company. So maybe give a little bit of background on the value proposition from a startup perspective, and then maybe from an established company perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe let me generalize value proposition a little bit. So, what does the company value, right? And what does the project sponsor value? So a startup company, at its very essence, is trying to have an impact, but the entrepreneur, the founder, wants to create something really valuable and wants to own a bunch of it. And that second part gets blown up so many times by not having the right priorities in the right direction. It doesn't really matter if you sell your company for $100 million if you only own 0.5% by then, because you've had some hiccups along the way, which do happen quite a lot. So I think the stage really gets set in that first raising money in the sort of sub $5 million value range is when your trajectory of dilution gets set. So, and then of course that relates to your market value proposition, because that's what people are going to be buying into. but the needs of companies are a little particular. Some companies are super strong technically, other ones are super strong in terms of market research, other ones are really strong clinically. So the way that we can complement them is a little different too. But I can talk a little bit later about what does it mean to build a whole enterprise whose mission is to have other companies be successful on their own terms, and making sure that we do that in a lean, super efficient way.
All right, so let's dive into this idea of equity preservation. So, and maybe use a hypothetical or not so hypothetical scenario. So I'm a startup and I've got an idea and I need capital. I mean, obviously, to bring any medical device to market, there is some capital that's going to be involved, and I'm trying to raise the right amount of capital, in line with my current value proposition, and I want to preserve equity. What are some of the things that a startup should be considering, or ways that they might be able to do that?
Great. So one of the things is to be skeptical of advice. I'm telling you this advice, to be skeptical of other people's advice. And what I mean by that is everybody sees the world through their own lens, right? You go talk to an IP attorney, and the most important thing you can be spending money on is IP. You go talk to a regulatory consultant. The most important thing is to get your regulatory strategy figured out. Go talk to a human factors expert. The most important thing is to understand the human factors implication, usability, because that will drive adoption. You talk to the technology people, and they'll say the most important thing is to get the technology figured out, or supply chain people or manufacturing people all have their own view, and they're all completely right. However, you have a limited number of dollars, and you got, if those people's ask adds up to, $10, and you only have $2, then how do you allocate the money, right? So, that's the actual situation everybody's in. They'd love to understand all those things as deep as possible. So there's a couple answers. One of them is risk. Like, what are the things that are actually going to be a risk, but not just risk of patient injury, but risk to the program, and try to address those ones first. And particularly with an eye towards what will drive your next round's value, right? The weird thing about equity finance startups is that $1 today is way more expensive than $1 next year. That's just, corporate, when we get to the corporate, it's a different animal. But in the startup world, if you're raising money at $1 million valuation, and 2 years from now you'd be raising at $10 million valuation, then $1, all you really care about is a share, right? So $1 2 years from now, it's actually worth 10 times less than $1 today. And so things that seem efficient from an overall program dollars actually don't make sense when you think of it that way. What you need to be doing is just brutally focus on the things that your investors will value in the next round.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I've talked to a lot of companies, and frankly, sometimes they're very early stage, and they are talking to me from a quality management system perspective, and obviously Greenlight sells an EQMS software platform. And my advice to them is, are they ready for that? I mean, don't mishear me. There are elements or behaviors that one can engage in and put in place even when you're early on, especially when it comes to good design and development, product development practices and product risk management practices that you can engage in. But to invest in a full QMS when you're not capitalized, and when you haven't reduced it to practice, and you're not at the appropriate stage of your company, that's not a good investment.
That's very true. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Because if your next round investors are going to ask you whether you've been audited to ISO 13485, then you need to do something. If that's not where you are, then kick that can down the road.
Yeah.
There's time to do those things right later.
Yeah.
And right now is when you're going to blow your brains out on equity.
Well, and I think this concept of an MVP, and I don't know if everybody listening is familiar with the acronym MVP, at least as it relates to product development, but that MVP methodology and lean methodologies, those have a lot of value, especially for early stage startups.
Yeah, so that's quite interesting. This language is sort of the lean startup, Eric Ries and Alex Osterwalder and those guys, and it was all of this. It comes from internet type startups, right? And the idea that you build a mock-up of your product and then you see how many people try to buy it, basically, right? And so there was kind of a school of thought in medtech for a long time that, well, that's all well and good in the internet type businesses, but it doesn't really apply to us because we got this regulatory barrier. You can't just start trying to sell a hip implant and see who buys it, or an ultrasound machine. That kind of beside the point. Because really, it's what are the things that you can do to demonstrate that you've addressed the critical risks. And I think to their benefit, a lot of the risks in a product development is whether the market will actually buy them, right? And we don't have the luxury of actually seeing whether people will give you cash for them today or not. That's unfortunate, but we can do a lot of things where we can give mock-ups to people, let them try them. Depending on the risk, we can let them try them on volunteers and so on. That doesn't, it's a complicated world sometimes. You can't test a heart valve. You can't test a heart valve on people, but you can test an ultrasound imager on people or on animals or something. Whatever you can do to efficiently get the risks out. We were working on a project in the dental area last year. We were talking to some of their advisory board members, and it was so interesting to realize that the big valuation milestone for them was going to be on clinical, and so the whole discussion shifted to how do we get what's the most efficient path we can get to for clinical, because then you'll be able to raise money at tens of millions of dollars value. And you can even redo some of the things that we did in the early stage. The most important thing is that if, at the end of the day, if you can have a company that you own 20% of instead of 1%, that's a whole different view of the world. You're the one taking all the risk and taking all the initiative and the emotional burden of building it. So the other important thing to understand about MVP is that as it was originally proposed, it's not actually a product. And a lot of people get confused about that. It's actually a version. It's a concept for a product more than it's a product, and so it's something that can be rapidly changed.
Yeah, and that actually the MVP approach is something that when we started Greenlight that we employed as we were getting started. For us, sort of that first MVP was a series of workflows and wireframes and screenshots. And once we got some market acceptance of that, then we moved to the next step in building beta software and so on and so forth. But even the concept or the approach has merit in tangible medical devices. I mean, I'll tell or share a short story about one of my very early experiences as a product development engineer. Getting to work with clinicians and they draw things literally on cocktail napkin sketches sometimes, or I would say some of the more mechanically inclined physicians I worked with would actually grab parts and pieces, from their office or from that they found around the hospital, and they would glue things and tape things together, and they would basically give me a prototype, an early stage prototype. I guess that is an MVP model. And then the next iteration might be go down the 3D prototyping, or maybe before that, maybe do some 3D rendering and things of that nature. So there's a whole level of quote prototyping or quote products that one can engage in. And each one of them don't just do prototyping for the sake of prototyping, but the idea behind various MVPs or various levels of product, various levels of prototypes, each one of them is for the purpose of learning something.
Yeah, you have a hypothesis, and this is your experiment. And you write down what your hypothesis is, and you write down the results of the experiment. And that basically you can think of, I think, a startup company, and particularly in medtech, as a series of experiments, right? And you're trying to figure out, can you figure out a value proposition that works, and can you figure out a market that it's properly aligned for? And of course, there's the technology questions, et cetera, et cetera. But we have a framework that we use when we're starting to work with a company. We call it Pathfinder. It basically works its way through a series of about 12 different functional areas. And we ask people, what's your IP situation? Who are you trying to sell to, and why are they going to use it, and why is it better than they're doing now? Why is it better enough that they're going to retrain all the nurses? And is the person spending the money going to get the benefit? And is the technology baked? Like, can you actually make it? And if you were to service it in the field, what that mean? And what are the human factors aspects of it? Do you have a reimbursement strategy? What's your consumable strategy? Do you understand what margins you need to make your product go? So it's kind of funny when we work through those things, because we're a product design company. And sometimes people come expecting that they're going to give us, we'll expect them to give us a very detailed specification, and then we will quote to fulfill that specification. But as we go through some of those questions, it becomes clear that would be doing them a disservice to dive in that way. We'd be much better off to help them work through some of those questions based on our 20 years of experience, so that when they give us a spec, we can actually develop it together, and then we can actually help them have a product that people will actually use, and they will make enough margin that somebody will want to buy it for money at the end of it, and so on.
Yeah, so you're really, the StarFish team is really helping these early stage companies not just advance their product, but you're helping them build a sound business.
Yeah, we're kind of like business consultants that do design, right?
So, and that's awesome.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It actually, we can talk about this after, but it forces a certain kind of training, certain kind of cultural orientation of the company to allow us to have a whole team of 140 people, all of whose mission in life is to have our clients be successful, more so than to just do to meet a spec.
Yeah, that's really, really cool. Of course, we could probably sit here and tell all kinds of horror stories all day about when things go bad. But before we jump to the value proposition from the lens of an established company, I guess just one thing that comes to mind, I hear a lot the sort of the rush to get first in human type of studies. Mm-hmm. And I'll be honest, I just more times than not, it scares me, because there's what I observe and what I hear from these conversations is really a lot of bad business. And I don't know if you have any comments or experiences that you would want to share on that topic.
We do have lots and lots of stories, as you can imagine. It's all about risk, right? If you're doing surgery on somebody, or you're implanting something in their body, or obviously the risks are very high. If you're taking an ultrasound image of them, it's not very high at all. As long as you make sure there's not enough energy to cause tissue damage, there's nothing wrong that could happen almost. We did have, I remember one client we were doing an ingestible product. It was, had some automation features and so on. But the first prototype, they wanted to try it on somebody.
Yeah.
And we did our own risk assessments. Nothing. Everything's biocompatible, but even so, do you set up a formal test or not? And so actually, I end up being the first clinical test subject.
Oh,
I find that actually that's not that I'm volunteering this to you, that I will be your test subject, but very often, if you have a clinical researcher as a startup entrepreneur, they'll often do things on themselves. It's kind of a normal thing. But there is a very strong ethical. The IRB, there's sort of institutional review boards that institutions have. Some of them are more conservative than others, but it's actually a great mechanism to force you to think through all the ways that your optimistic entrepreneurial thing could hurt somebody, right?
Absolutely. You share that story reminded me of a call we had a few years ago. I won't go into grave detail about the product, but let's just say when the lady was talking to us, she's like, "Oh yeah, I'm wearing it right now, and I got a bunch of my friends that are wearing it right now." And this is like an electromechanical device that well, they hadn't done anything as far as any testing whatsoever. And I'm like, oh, dang, you're brave. But anyway, we'll shift gears a little bit. So, all right, so we've talked a little bit about the value proposition for medical device product development for startups. Let's kind of look through a different lens. I'm an established company. I've already got products to market. I've been through this time, maybe time and time again. How is the value proposition different?
Yeah, so I think, the market value proposition is only marginally different. I think, obviously these established companies have existing distribution channels and relationships, so they have the opportunity to drop something into that existing channel that a startup wouldn't have. So there's some of that. And I'm not really an expert on market strategy, but those are just the things that we observe and maybe common sense. But I think in terms of a project, and maybe seeing through that same lens of equity preservation, obviously in a corporate setting, the person who owns this product is going to be a product manager, probably within a division of the corporate company. And how do they win in this whole situation? Basically, there's, whereas in a startup you have equity rounds and certain dilution, in a corporate setting, you basically get approval rounds where the corporation agrees to give more resources to allow a program to move forward, right? And how can you be as efficient as possible and also give the greatest chance for this opportunity to be able to move forward? And so, from an engineer working on a program, in some ways it's not that different. Like, we still got to be super efficient. We got to be focused on whatever they value in the next milestone. But we just have to recognize that this notion that future money is cheaper than current money doesn't really apply.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And it seems like, if I'm looking at it from an established company lens, not that this doesn't have importance to the startup, but it seems like my emphasis is probably more heavily skewed towards regulatory processes and submissions and getting clearance. Would you agree?
Oh yeah, So that's right. Whereas a startup company is going to have some big holes that they don't even recognize in many cases, right? So we have to kind of support them to point out the places where maybe they're not as strong as they think they are, where that they would, some additional attention would save them from falling off a cliff or into a hole. But the bigger guys are almost the other way around, right? They've got very powerful legal teams that you spend endless time hashing out non-disclosure and non-compete kind of provisions, and they've got their corporate regulatory will come in like a ton of bricks, and want everything to be perfectly buttoned up, and that may or may not be lined up that well with what that product manager needs at that moment. So it takes, in some ways, a more sophisticated type of communication in the program management office on our side to be able to work with the corporation so that we can recognize the various different influencers and players and how much influence they have and how to satisfy what they need without compromising what the product manager really needs for success.
Very cool. So, folks, I want to remind you, I'm talking to Scott Phillips. Scott is the CEO of StarFish Medical. StarFish Medical is a leading service provider and medical device design company. And as we learned just a few minutes ago, they do more than design. They help you run and establish sound business practices in your endeavors to bring new products to market. A big part of the product development process in the medical device industry, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about design controls and ISO 14971 risk management and how that all plays in. And certainly if as we talk today and even beyond today, I want you to know the Greenlight Guru EQMS software platform. We've designed this platform specifically for the medical device industry by medical device professionals. So we've got workflows to manage traceability from a design perspective and integrate that with risk, as well as all the post-market needs that you're going to get into at some point in time whenever you launch your product. So, Scott, kind of diving back in, I mean, we've touched a little bit on the established company lens, the startup lens. and through the conversation, we've talked a little bit about where they're the same and where they're different. Any other thoughts that you have about sort of the pros and cons, or the yin and the yang, or the complementary or contradictory aspects of product development, depending on the shape and size of company?
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about the difference, this equity preservation idea, and so on. I think that one of the biggest things is that is in the product management role, that startups probably, in many cases, some of them are product managers that came out, but often they're technology experts. They don't even quite realize what the product management role is. So dialing in that value proposition, actually, there's a couple things. So that's one of the things. Like when we start a relationship with a company like that, it often starts with people saying, we want a box this shape, and it's going to be this long, it's going to have these buttons on the front. And and we ask a few questions like, so, okay, we understand that. So how many users have you talked to so far? And how confident are you that this is really going to address their needs? And what regulatory are you complying with so far? And do you have a quality system? And usually somewhere in that mix of discussion, there's a recognition that, in fact, the relationship should be a little different than how they envisioned it, that we have a lot more to help them with. And then it becomes a more cooperative engagement to try to work together to have them be successful, right? And some of those things are things that would fall into the bucket of product management. Like if you haven't talked to 50 or 100 users yet, then it would be beneficial to have a couple of our top technical people go to the field with you and go talk to them, because we have bring a perspective that you don't have a background in what it takes to commercialize one. And there's a ton to be added in that respect. And when you're talking to a corporate client, they have a product management role. It's probably somebody who's been well-trained. They know that they want us to go in the field and go talk to the end users, because, products, the idea that you write down 30 pages of specs and give it to an engineer and out comes the perfect thing is actually not how it works. And,
no. As you were sharing that, I was reminiscing a bit about very early on in my career. I did the company I was working for at the time. I mean, you would call them today. You would call them a large corporate entity. I guess you would probably call them that 20 years ago. But we behaved very much like a startup, and I don't know why they still behave that way. I don't know. I think it's just because they were founded by an entrepreneur. The entrepreneur was still very involved in the business. But anyway, I remember I mentioned a moment ago, the prototype from a doctor, that's something that was taped and glued together. And basically, my first experience or two, I basically took that prototype from this key opinion leader, and I quote, engineered it in a way that could be manufactured, got through all the hurdles, all the design control activities, regulatory submissions, things of that nature, launched the product with a thud because it was only designed for that one user. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I tried not to make that mistake again, because, I think humans are, not all, but a lot of humans are very good about solving their problems in the form of a prototype or an idea or a concept. But you need to vet that idea beyond just that one key opinion leader.
That's absolutely. Well, I'm always got that little red flag ready to start waving as soon as I hear any story like that. In fact, I was talking to a company last week, and they had really incorporated one particular patient as their sort of mission in life. And when they talked about that, the patient was the face of the company, and their mission in life was to help this patient. The red flag started going for me, like, oh my gosh, like that's very admirable in one sense, but how confident are you that if you talk to 100 people, that the stories would all be similar enough to this person that you understand what they all need?
Yeah.
And how open are you going to be in that situation to actually shift to be what they need? I think it's very easy to close your mind and jump to conclusions. And as you say, it's particularly KOL type doctors are prone to this kind of risk, because they really, in their mind, they are the market. They come to embody the market. And that's one of our sort of rhetorical challenges early on, is to try to help them understand that they're way more skilled than the market. And if they're a KOL doctor, chances are they're one of the top doctors in their field, but their market is not all top doctors like them. They're sort of middle of the road kind of doctors who maybe only do that type of surgery once every month and not every day.
Right. So it's important, folks, that, especially for those out there who may be startups that are based on a technology or research that maybe you've had a hand in from day one, is cast a wider net, get more feedback and input from others that are in that market space. At the end of the day, you're going to go through a lot of challenges, a lot of trials, a lot of tribulations in bringing a new product to market, and a lot of cost. And, hopefully you've done a good job of preserving your equity along the way. And you want that equity and that value of that product and the quality of life impact to be as great as it possibly can once you get there. So do a little bit of your homework up front, leverage experts in this space like Scott and his team at StarFish Medical. Scott, any other final words before we wrap up today's podcast?
Oh, that's a great question. I was going to dive into value proposition, but that would be more of a 10-minute extension. So my final words, honestly, it's been a total pleasure to talk to you, explore some of these themes. I guess my final word would just be think broadly and talk to a lot of people and realize that, don't fall in love with your ideas. If you're open to talk to a lot of people and hearing what they have to say, and be open to the idea that maybe people will not be willing to pay for your thing or for the benefit that you bring, and use that as an opportunity to find the thing that will.
Yeah, that's great advice. And folks, Scott's right. We're just barely skimming the surface on this topic of value proposition for medical device product development. Of course, we're talking to an expert in this field, Scott Phillips at StarFish Medical. Reach out to him. We'll include information about StarFish Medical in the post that accompanies this podcast. And I really want to thank Scott for being my guest today. As always, if you have ideas, suggestions, comments about things that you'd like to hear about on the Global Medical Device Podcast or other content pieces that we can put out through Greenlight Guru, just let me know. Happy to take that feedback, and this is for you, and happy to help provide guidance, direction, and education on the things that you're trying to do in the medical device industry. As always, this is your host, the founder and VP of Quality and Regulatory at Greenlight Guru, John Spear, and you have been listening to the Global Medical Device Podcast.